Hi, and welcome to week 6 of History 358. Um, Over the past few weeks, we've talked at some length about how the new regime, the Bolshevik regime, after October, sought to reconfigure, rebuild the political, social, and economic landscape of Russia, to recreate Russia in their own image. And we saw that reflected in the various decrees issued by the new Soviet government, the one party state. We looked at various economic policies. We looked at how the state, the new regime, deployed coercive measures to implement its vision. But a point I want to make this week, as we shift to culture, is to think about the cultural dimension of the Russian Revolution as well. And I want to switch over to our slides for the day. There we go. Oh, don't want to give anything away. These terms are terms for the whole week. We'll have 2 lectures this week, but I want to just put them all up here, and you can get them, and I'll put them up at the beginning of lecture 2 as well. Clicking current slide. So the revolution has this important cultural dimension as well, and we'll be focusing this week on culture and society in Russia in the 1920s, which, as I mentioned last time when we talked about NEP, the new economic policy, the 20s are a very exciting, vibrant time, a time of great ferment, a time when individuals, various associative groups, and the state and party itself are experimenting with ways to build a new culture. The Bolsheviks believe that they are creating a new world. They're creating a new world that will do away with the old dispensations, that will put an end to the old cruelties, the old injustices, the old inequities. So the revolution is not just about remaking politics. It's not just about reconfiguring modes of economic production. It's about creating a new way of life. And it's about making new kinds of people, too. A theme that Bulgakov plays with in Heart of a Dog. And this idea of remaking a new world, a very romantic, heroic, attractive project, is what draws a lot of men and women over to the platform of the new regime. It's a very exciting undertaking. So the revolution, I'm going to show you this here in a moment, seeks to establish new modes of social interaction. The revolution seeks to create the new Soviet man, the new Soviet woman. And these are terms that are actually used in party lectures, in the party press, in the newspapers at this time. The new Soviet woman. What will she look like? What traits will she exhibit? What will be her relationship to society? What kind of opportunities for self-fulfillment will be available to the new Soviet woman and the new Soviet man? We'll be talking about that more. I want to talk also about these patterns of everyday life. The Russian word is byt. The Russian word byt means established habits, how we interact with others, how we go about our daily lives. It encompasses everything from reading habits to patterns of education to gender roles to marriage practices, sexual relations, a huge all-encompassing term. And the point I want to stress here this week is that as the Bolsheviks sought to remake economics, politics, and society, so too did they seek to remake the existing patterns of everyday life and forge new ones, right? As this poster shows from the end of the Civil War, we're moving forward. You see here in the front a Red Army lecturer speaking to a group of working men and women, judging by their dress. He's pointing to an open book, and it reads, "From darkness to light, from battles to books, from woe to happiness. And behind the books, or beyond the book, are these bright, shining, new, modern buildings that read on their fronts labor, art, and science. So there's a lot going on in this image. One message being sent here is that it's through books, it's through learning, it's through the acquisition of knowledge that the new world, this bright, shining, radiant future, will be achieved. And look how modern it is. There's modern factory buildings, there's electric lines. Electricity was heralded by Lenin and the Bolsheviks as a great sign of progress, as a great sign of scientific advance. And so the bright, shining world here is a world that will be shining in part because it is illuminated through electricity. And it's through knowledge that we'll get to that point, right? The Civil War is over. We're now moving from battles to books. We're now setting about the cultural element of socialist construction. And look at what awaits us in the future, right? This bright, radiant, shining city. And the Bolsheviks took this very, very seriously. If you think back to our discussion of Marxism in week 2, that fundamental premise of Marxist thought that runs through all dozens and dozens of volumes of Marx's writing is that there is a fundamental determinative relationship between the base, the economic material base, and the superstructure, the realm of ideas, the realm of cultural practices, etc. Once that base changes through revolutionary conflict, a new base is formed. And atop that new base, now, a new superstructure will form. So the Bolsheviks, good Marxist theorists as they are firmly convinced that now that we've sloughed off the old skin of the old regime, we've tossed aside the old base, we're building a new base, and atop that base, a new superstructure will arise, and all bets are off. We can remake everything. We can fundamentally change the way people live. We can fundamentally change the way they interact with others. We can fundamentally change and do away with the limitations on self-realization imposed on men and women by the injustices of the old order. That's why Marx and others always go back to this point that only under true communism will men and women be able to realize their true individual human potential, their true individual human selves. So this bright, shining, happy, awesome world awaits. And that's what I want to focus on. Not to give anything away, spoiler alert, that never completely happens. There is, in the realm of culture building, as in all of the other aspects of Bolshevik policy, that inevitable tension between ideas and reality, between vision and the difficulties of implementing those visions onto real life soil. Last thing I want to say before we get into this, again, the radiant future may not look so radiant to us, but in the 1920-21 sense, this is a bright, radiant future of clean, straight lines, urban living, design, progress, planning, that very important Bolshevik notion of planning that we talked about with VSNH and war communism last week. The emphasis on construction here is very interesting. The Bolsheviks described what they were doing as, the Russian phrase isn't important, but it was called kulturное строительство, which means culture building. Building a new culture. And that word строительство is the same word that you would use in Russian for building a factory, building a dam, any kind of architectural engineering undertaking. And so the Bolsheviks used that sort of metaphor of construction. And I think that's very interesting here. They were constructing a new culture. And again, there are no rules. There are no blueprints. Bolshevik thinkers, Bolshevik theorists, party members, non-party members too, are feeling their way throughout the 1920s, right? And so it's a truly revolutionary project. Remaking culture. What will that look like? What will that be? Now, let's just stop for a moment and think about what we mean by culture. And think for a minute about what the word culture means to you. Let me tell you what the Bolsheviks don't mean by culture. Culture, kultura, for the Bolsheviks in the 1920s doesn't mean what we might think of as high culture, right? We often draw this line between popular culture, Netflix, and high culture, going to the ballet, going to the symphony, right? Culture, as the Bolsheviks are using it in the 1920s, is something bigger, right? When historians and anthropologists and Bolsheviks talk about culture, what they mean is this whole set of norms and codes and systems of value by which individual men and women and society as a whole interact with each other at the personal and social level. Culture is the lens through which we construct meaning about the world around us. It's how we make sense of the world around us. So when the Bolsheviks are talking about culture, they're not talking about getting every peasant to listen to Beethoven. Although over time, they would like that. By the 1930s, that would be a nice thing. But in the 1920s, when they're talking about culture, they're talking about remaking every aspect of human interaction. Remaking education, remaking gender roles, remaking notions of child rearing, remaking attitudes towards religion and science, remaking the way that individuals approach questions of hygiene and public health. So this is about as far-reaching, ambitious a project as you can imagine. Bolsheviks placed enormous emphasis on this. And what I want to do in the first lecture today is think a little bit about culture building with regards to education. In the 1920s, look a little bit about questions of public health, look a little bit at questions of religion and anti-religion, and keep in the back of our heads this idea about the difficulties that the Bolsheviks face, even after the breathing room of NEP, the new economic policy, the enormous challenges that culture building imposes. How do you legislate? How do you decree new modes of human interaction? Well, the short answer is you can't, really, right? And the Bolsheviks find this out. So there's a tension throughout the 1920s of where the Bolsheviks want to go and how fast they can get there, or whether they can get there. There will be resistance among certain elements of the population who don't want their everyday life, trampled under and replaced with a new one. Okay? And then in our second lecture, I want to talk and look at more closely gender roles, the idea of the new Soviet woman, etc. Okay? All right, so let's talk about education. The Russian language has two words for education: образование and воспитание. The word образование, the top word here, refers to the conveyance of knowledge. We might think of it as classroom instruction. The second idea of education, воспитание, is a bigger notion. It's a more all-encompassing, a more holistic idea. It refers to the molding and shaping of the self, the molding and shaping of personality. And those of you who've taken courses in the School of Ed or the history of pedagogy know that these, Russian is not alone here in having these two complementary ideas about what constitutes upbringing, what constitutes education. I want to look at classroom education, but I'll just with regard to Vоспитание, we might say that the entire Soviet regime, all state institutions after October, were dedicated in one sense or another to this overarching project of Vоспитание, of creating, molding the personality of citizen subjects. Trade unions, the Red Army, schools, youth organizations. All of these institutions, which were under nominal state and party control, had as part of their objective the idea of inculcating in the citizenry the true spirit of party discipline, the true spirit of communism. Um, a lot of foreign observers who came to Russia in the 1920s and traveled around um, came back and remarked that the whole country seems like a gigantic school. Factory workers at the end of the day have to sit through lessons on Marxism, Leninism. They're lectured on the new way of life and how they ought to embody it. So the Bolsheviks saw this project of upbringing, of rearing new types of people, remolding existing people into new kinds of people as a 24/7 job. And this kind of goes back to various Enlightenment theory ideas, the ideas of Helvetius and other Enlightenment philosophers who imagined an ideal society as one that was constantly shaping, constantly training its members um, in accordance with this ideal vision. And the Bolsheviks took this very, very seriously. We saw this when we talked about the Red Army, when we talked about the Civil War. So the Bolsheviks place enormous emphasis on the larger project of Vospitania, but they're also very much interested in the question of obrazovание, of classroom education, in part because the Bolsheviks saw the classroom, Bolshevik educators saw the classroom as an opportunity to condition and shape the minds and psyches of children. They saw the classroom as an opportunity also to promote the values of the new regime, not only communist theory, Marxism, Leninism, but also the ideals of science, the ideals of technology, to use the classroom to create an educated, technologically literate generation of Soviet citizens who 10, 15, 20 more years down the road would take the helm, would become the engineers, the scientists, the doctors, the professors of the new regime. We wouldn't have to rely on backwards vestiges from the old regime, Perezhitki. We don't have to rely on czarist officers to staff and man and lead the Red Army when we have our own. We don't have to rely on unreliable bureaucrats from the old regime when we have our own bookkeepers and clerks and office workers. We don't have to rely on bourgeois professors, pseudo crypto liberals, when we train our own red professoriate to shape the minds of tomorrow, right? We'll do away with these perezhitki, with these vestiges, these appendages left over us from the old order, and we'll create our new leaders of tomorrow. So that's why education was very, very important. The Bolsheviks were playing a long game, right? So Bolshevik educators saw the classroom as a laboratory, as a space in which they could, through experimentation, create new Soviet citizens. And this conviction was reflected in official party documents. The 1919 party program, in which the party laid out its vision of where it's going and what lies ahead. The 1919 party program defined the school, the institution of schools, as, quote, an instrument for the communist transformation of society. That's probably what your uncle says at Thanksgiving about public schools in this country. But the Bolsheviks explicitly see the school as a transformative institution to get hold of the young, and not in an insidious sense, but they see this really as an opportunity. We get hold of the young, we bring them over to our way of life, in our way of thinking, we create a new generation. Going on, the school was a means to cleanse, and this is the word used in the party program, cleanse pupils of the old bourgeois ideas that have now been made obsolete by the revolution. Cleansing, this idea of a rebaptism, a repurification, washing away all the old crap that the priests and teachers from the old regime had filled the heads of the young with, shaking all that garbage out and starting afresh, starting anew, right? A good example of this is religion. Religion had been, and by religion I mean Orthodox Christian theology, had been part of the curriculum, the classroom curriculum. It was a subject that you took in school under the old regime, under the czars. With the separation of church and state in January of 1918, religious instruction is forbidden in schools. And in its place, schools begin to teach what the Bolsheviks will refer to as scientific atheism, using science, biology, chemistry, physics, history, and social sciences as well to demonstrate, if you will, to young students the impossibility of religion, and to supplant that part of the head filled with religion, to replace it with a reliance, a belief, if you will, in science. The new Soviet school was also supposed to teach ethics, to teach values, good communist party-minded values to young people, to make them into constructive members of the socialist society that we're building, that we're constructing. Now, the government body in charge of education policy was the People's Commissariat of Enlightenment. And that word is very telling, literally, enlightenment, prosvещение in Russian. The People's Commissariat of Enlightenment, or Narkompros, under the leadership of Anatoly Lunacharsky. The People's Commissariat of Enlightenment handled not only libraries and theaters and museums across the country, but also the school system, and that was sort of the key element of their mission, of their charge. Narkompros, the People's Commissariat of Enlightenment, took very seriously this idea of education, and education began, according to Narkompros officials, even before you went to school. Education began the instant the child comes out of the womb. So in December of 1917, just weeks after October, the People's Commissariat of Enlightenment issues a directive explaining where they want to go forward with education, why education matters. They say in this decree, the public education of children, free of charge, should begin the day they are born. We must incorporate preschool education into the general system of public education in order to lay down the foundation work for the proper social upbringing of the child at his or her earliest stages of development. Doing so, it goes on, and starting young, starting when they're at preschool age, will produce a physically and spiritually fully developed member of society, willing and able to work for the collective betterment of all. So, statements like this let us see, I think, how Narkompros officials, Soviet pedagogues, those who are interested in education policy at this time, how they want to fuse the idea of classroom education with this broader sense of shaping character, fusing образование and воспитание. This is part of the Soviet approach to raising up the new generation. Soviet pedagogues, educational thinkers, wondered, debated amongst themselves the question of responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to educate the child? Most Narkompros theorists rejected as outdated and bourgeois the notion that a child's education was the responsibility of his parents alone. For confirmation of this, we'll turn to Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, co-author of The ABC of Communism, Preobrazhensky was not only an economist and theorist, but also an occasional dabbler in education policy. You can see from his death date, he died during the Stalinist purges, to which we'll turn in a few weeks, but he was riding high in the 20s, a well-respected member of the party elite, a well-respected thinker and theorist. And this is what Preobrazhensky has to say in the early 20s about education and children. He says, "From the socialist point of view, it is utterly senseless for an individual member of society to treat his body as if it were his inalienable personal property, because the individual is but one link in the transition of the species from the past to the present. 10 times more senseless is it to treat one's offspring as one's personal property." What is he saying here? If individuals are but a link in the chain of humanity from past to present to future, then it would be unutterably selfish of us to imagine that we are not connected in this great chain of being. And again, Preobrazhensky is thinking about historical progression in a very Marxist sense. But that last line, I think, is very telling. 10 times more senseless is it to treat one's offspring as one's personal property. So in other words, what Preobrazhensky and other 20s theorists are putting forward is the idea that there is a role for the parents to play, but there's also a bigger supervisory, regulatory role for the state and for society to play. This is a collective problem. Education is a collective issue. So the Bolsheviks set about remaking education with these ideas in mind. They nationalize all educational institutions, just as they had with the factories and the mines and the railroads. They take over the school system. They take over the system of private schools. They take over church schools. They take over the public schools that had been administered by the old imperial Ministry of Education. And higher education as well. A decree from May 30th, 1918 declares that all schools, not just elementary and secondary, but colleges and universities as well, whether they were public or formerly private, are now placed under the jurisdictional authority of Narkompros, the People's Commissariat of Enlightenment. So according to this decree, and here you see Lunacharsky, the head of Narkompros, according to this decree, the purpose of this nationalization was to ensure that the education of young minds was carried out in accordance with the party's vision, or as the decree put it, carried out in accordance with the principles of modern pedagogy and socialism. So this decree from May 30th, 1918, nationalizing the educational system, makes education essentially a state monopoly. And all sorts of sweeping changes were introduced in the sphere of education under Lunacharsky's watch. Narkompros decreed that attendance was obligatory. All school-aged children, boys and girls, had to go to school. Classrooms would be co-ed, boys and girls, children learning together. Curricula, learning plans, learning outcomes, as we say today in the modern vernacular, would be determined not by local teachers, but by officials at Narkompros. So that same emphasis on centralization that we saw with economic planning, so too here in the sphere of education, that the experts at the center decide and then disseminate that wisdom to the practitioners in various towns and cities and villages across the country. The curricula would be determined by the center. Standardized norms would be established at the center and implemented in schools across Soviet Russia. Now, Lunacharsky, remarkably interesting figure, and one of the most interesting of the early Bolsheviks. He was not an advocate of terror. He was not an advocate of the cruel, coercive measures. In fact, Lunacharsky when the October Revolution spread from Petrograd to Moscow and there was street fighting in the Kremlin, Lunacharsky burst into Lenin's office in tears and said, "There's fighting in the Kremlin. They're shooting up all the old historic buildings. What are we going to do?" And Lenin just laughs at him and calls him a weakling. He says, "Well, who cares if a few old cathedrals get shot up if we take power in Moscow?" Well, Lunacharsky cared. He was a very artistic person, a very sensitive, artistic soul. He himself was a writer and a poet and a playwright, um, and sought to kind of strike a balance between preserving the architectural and historic monuments of the Russian past while also moving forward into the bright, radiant socialist future. So a really interesting guy. Lunacharsky was a great follower of anything deemed progressive at the time. New progressive trends in the theater, new progressive trends in cinema, new progressive trends in pedagogy, in teaching. And so Lunacharsky, looking to Montessori models that were being developed in Europe at this time, looking to new theories coming out of developmental psychology, comes up with this idea that, a very radical idea, that students' progress, students' performance ought not to be assessed by the teacher or professor, but rather by the collective student body. In other words, your peers will grade you at the end of the semester. We must do away with corporal punishment, which was vicious under the old school system. If you read Gorky's memoirs of growing up in the Volga provinces and attending public schools under the Tsarist regime, the level of corporal punishment, casual brutality is just disgusting. We must do away with all of this, Lunacharsky said. We will not discipline the bodies of our young charges, right? That's something that we have thrown out with the old regime. Well, also thrown out with the old regime was the idea of homework or exams. Lunacharsky said, let's do away with all of that. Well, that's going to cause some problems, as you can see. What about administrating the schools? How do you govern the school? How do you run the school at the local level? Well, just having one principal is like having a little czar. We don't want that. So let's create school committees, local committees, and we'll get teachers to be on the committee. We'll get older students to be on the committee. We'll get workers from the local factories to sit on the committees, as if the workers don't have enough to do, working 10-hour days, 12-hour days, having to sit through a Marxism-Leninism lecture, and then having to go back out at night after dinner to sit on the local school committee. There's only so much work you can get out of the proletariat. But the idea was to involve all social classes in this project that concerned all social classes, the creation of new minds for the new society, right? So Lunacharsky called these his experimental schools. And he spent most of 1918 drafting up pie-in-the-sky plans for implementing these experimental schools. They remained largely on paper, and I stress that point, because think about the timing here. 1918, 1919, the Civil War is raging. Industry is in shambles. Schools are, let's just say, under-prioritized as the Bolshevik regime is fighting for its very life. So the utopian dreams, the revolutionary visions of Lunacharsky and others at Narkompros simply could not be implemented in the context of civil war and war communism. There were no material resources available to carry out this vision. Now, let me give you some examples of how bad things were in terms of school funding during the Civil War and the beginning of NEP. Most schools were shut down. There's no fuel. There's no gas to light the lamps. The kids can't see anything. There's no textbooks. The books have all been commandeered, pulped, used for party posters and newspapers as part of the propaganda campaign. The teachers in the schools that were still open were miserably paid. As late as 1925, the height of NEP, teachers in Kiev earned about 45 rubles a month. That's a meager salary. The school janitors earned 70. And the teachers, too, not only had to deal with horrible pay, bad conditions, but also these wild, crazy directives coming out of Narkompros. Um, why are the guys from the local steel mill serving on the school committee? Why are they helping to shape our curriculum? The teachers had no idea of what was expected of them. So there's confusion, there's miscommunication between the center, Narkompros, and the schools sort of on the ground, if you will. Another key figure in the Narkompros, the educational wing of Narkompros, was Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, a trusted comrade, his closest comrade. They had been married while in Siberian exile in the late 1890s. They stayed together for the remainder of his life, and Krupskaya lived on for another 15 years and continued her party work and activism. She was a tireless advocate for women workers and women peasants, and also very interested in questions of education. Krupskaya, during the Civil War, went on an inspection tour of provincial schools in the Volga River region, and she said, these schools are producing, literally, she said, nothing but nonsense. The teachers are beginning to make sense of what we are asking them, but the majority understands nothing, and they ask such absurd questions of you that you stand there astounded. By the end of the Civil War, Krupskaya and Lunacharsky and others must admit that the experimental dream system that they had sketched out in the headiest days following October was a failure. And the introduction of NEP allows Narkompros officials to go back to the drawing board. And they come up with a new model of education in which more traditional forms are reintroduced, but the content remains revolutionary. So starting in the 1920s with NEP, and really throughout the next, 70 years of the USSR up until 1991, what we see is this sort of standard format. Students in desks, teachers in the front of the classroom, but a revolutionary content, a socialist content. If you were to go to a Soviet school in the 1920s, it would look, in terms of the staging, if you will, a classroom staging, it would look like a classroom in Omaha or Missoula. But what's different is the content, right? So what the Bolsheviks come up with after the failures of the war communism period is a new approach that takes old models but infuses them with new party-minded socialist content. Now, one big problem that education officials faced is that the teachers across Soviet Russia were not members of the party. Could they be trusted? As late as 1926, only 3% of teachers in elementary schools were members of the Communist Party. Remember, the Bolsheviks renamed themselves the Communist Party. Only 5.5% of teachers in high schools were members of the party. And Lunacharsky estimates that 30 to 40% of teachers in all Soviet schools at all levels are practicing members of the Russian Orthodox Church. That presents certain problems for the atheist state, as you might imagine. So how do we deal with the problem of potentially politically unreliable teachers? Well, we'll train new teachers a generation down the road, right? We'll train our own red teachers who have been brought up in the new system, who know how to approach every matter from a proper socialist point of view. But in the meantime, we have to create youth organizations that will be part of that Vaspitania project of shaping the individual personhood, shaping the individual's self. And the Commissariat of Enlightenment and the Soviet government and the Communist Party create these youth organizations and rely on them quite heavily. The Young Pioneers, let me go back and show you this. The Young Pioneers and the Union of Communist Youth, or the Komsomol. These are the two principal youth organizations founded in the 1920s to help shape the moral, ethical character of Soviet youth. The Pioneers were formed in 1922 explicitly on the model of the Boy Scouts. And there are, in the interwar period, the period between the two world wars, all across Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Europe especially, there are these youth organizations that are founded to teach manliness, to teach masculinity, but also to teach the values of that society. In Poland, the youth leagues emphasize the importance of patriotism and Catholicism. In Soviet Russia, the youth organizations, predictably, are going to stress the importance of communist ethics, communist values, similar to what we read in our reading this week in anticipation of Friday's discussion. So they're like little communist Boy Scouts. And the Young Pioneers were open to boys and girls under the age of 15. And the Young Pioneers would become a kind of after-school school for children to learn good communist values. And the first duty of a young pioneer was to be faithful to the working class, to be faithful to the principles and teachings of communism. By 1926, 2 million Soviet boys and girls had joined the Pioneers. And here you see a Pioneer membership card. I apologize, it's a little bit blurry. This is from the late 1950s. But you have here the ceremonial oath that a young pioneer takes. And again, that first line is to be loyal to the working class, faithful to the working class, and to be faithful to communism. And you see the boy and girl have their arms bent in that kind of pioneer salute. Here, a troop of young pioneers on Red Square, St. Basil's Cathedral, looms behind them. They're poised to go visit Lenin's mausoleum. And you see their scout leader, their pack leader, is sort of adjusting the little red kerchief. The red kerchief is the distinctive sort of trademark of the young pioneer costume. And again, here young pioneers taking the oath required of them. The oath is very interesting. As I said, you pledge your faithfulness, your fidelity to the working class, which is part of that Leninist conceit, right? That the party is the vanguard of the working class. The party will lead forward the proletariat. Even after the revolution, will play a role in leading the proletariat forward in the process of building socialism and building communism. And the oath reads, in part, "The pioneer is a young builder of communism." Again, that emphasis on construction. We're literally building communism, like we build a bridge. The pioneer is a reliable comrade. He respects his elders, he looks after little children, and always acts according to conscience. So when we read these pieces this week on communist ethics, on what a party member ought to be like, what sort of values ought that party member to exhibit and inhabit, it starts in these youth leagues. The Pioneers were a recruiting ground for the Komsomol, and the Komsomol fed its best members into the Communist Party. So these youth organizations were supposed to be a means to teach, or if you prefer, indoctrinate children, but also to entertain them, but also to serve as a kind of feeder system to prepare the best and brightest of the young generation for a future career in state and party service. And as you read Lenin's speech to the Komsomol that we're going to discuss on Friday, he lays out there sort of the importance of the Komsomol, of the Communist Youth League. The ranks of the Komsomol grow over the course of the 1920s and beyond. In 1926, there's about 1.25 million men and women in the Komsomol, and these are, 18 to 22-year-olds, let's say, roughly. 1.25 million in 1926, 10.3 million by 1941. Now, clearly, a lot of these people are going into the Komsomol because it was the expected thing to do. And some of my Russian friends of a certain age went into the Komsomol in the late 70s, 80s, because it was the expected thing to do. You want to get a cushy job, relatively cushy, you join the party. The Komsomol is the best way to do it. But there were also true believers among them, especially in these early days. People who joined the Komsomol because they were inspired, because they were fired up by this idea of building socialism, making a new world. I want to share with you a letter written in 1924, just a brief excerpt of a 1924 letter written by a young man serving in the 1st Red Artillery Brigade. He's writing to his relatives back home in his village in the province of Tver. The reason we have this letter, and thousands and thousands and thousands of letters like it, is because it was intercepted by Cheka censors who were looking for incriminating material. The letter never reached its destination. It was instead sent to the state and party archives, which is why we have it today. So, ironically, one of the best avenues we have for thinking about and recreating the mentality of ordinary people during the 1920s comes to us from the paranoia of the Cheka, so busy spying on its own citizens that it ended up inadvertently creating for future generations of researchers and historians this huge cache of evidence that allows us to kind of look at what ordinary people thought about things in the 1920s. So it's just a fascinating set of sources here. So, a young soldier writing back home to his relatives in the village. Now think, 1924, he's been in the Red Army. He's experienced this whole kind of new way of life. He's been exposed to literacy. He's been exposed to Marxist-Leninist teachings. He's seen the world. His relatives back home are still muddy and in the village. And this is what he has to say to them. I wanted to let you know, folks, I've joined the Komsomol. I know this will cause you to curse, but that's because you think that all Komsomols are crooks. But to the contrary, I will be honest. I will fight against village ignorance, and I will explain to the peasants what Soviet power is all about. I don't want you to think that I'll somehow become a drunk. We're fighting now against drinking and smoking. So there's a lot going on here, but his pledge to be honest, his pledge to fight against village ignorance, to bring a new way of life to the rural settlements of Russia, and also the ingrained suspicion, the hostility that rural audiences have for these urban institutions, which they view as, avenues of corruption, right? Don't worry, he says, I'm not going to become a drunk. In fact, we're fighting against the abuse of alcohol. We're fighting against village patterns of drunkenness, and village culture was soaked in booze. We're fighting against that. Again, part of the Bolsheviks' vision of making a new culture. The Bolsheviks, puritanical as they were, embraced a kind of temperance culture. So I mentioned that letter because this, you have a great example here of an individual, right? An ordinary guy, a soldier in 1924, writing to his family and explaining what the Komsomol means to him, right? As opposed to us reading Komsomol propaganda, we have that sort of, we're able to say something about the reception of that message, which I think historically analytically is very interesting. So here you see some Komsomoltsi or communist youth members, probably from the late 30s or maybe even from the beginning of World War II. Again, they're supposed to embody this strong moral character. And in the readings by Aaron Soltz and others for this week, you get a sense of what those moral, ethical qualities were supposed to be. Um, it goes back, I would argue, to that idea of the professional revolutionary outlined in Chernyshevsky's novel What Is to Be Done from 1863, picked up on and carried forward by Lenin in 1902, What Is to Be Done. The professional revolutionary is a man or woman whose entire life is devoted to the cause. And the good Komsomolets, the good Communist Youth League member, similarly is one whose entire life ought to be organized along those principles with a high moral caliber, a kind of revolutionary asceticism. This is a nice poster from 1924, done in a very kind of abstract, constructivist, geometric style, popular with early Soviet authors, or excuse me, early Soviet artists. It rejects the kind of softened bourgeois modes of representing the male and especially the female sex. Instead, a good example of kind of creating a new Soviet aesthetic. And the flag that the young man and young woman are bearing, long live the Komsomol, on the 7th anniversary of the Great Change of the October Revolution. And you see the Komsomoltsi marching side by side, equal, beneath the red banner. The young army marches forward. I want to talk a little bit about literacy. Now, this is an image that can be unpacked through visual analysis, but there's a lot of text. And that reminds us, who in 1924 could have read this? Literacy was a huge problem. Or let me rephrase that. The lack of literacy, illiteracy, was seen by the Bolsheviks as an enormous problem. Why? Because socialism, the highest, most supreme form of social and economic organization until you get to communism, required a certain level of commitment, buy-in, cultural advancement on the part of its citizen subjects, right? Lunacharsky and others lamented throughout the 1920s, right? How do we build socialism in a country that's so backwards, in a country where illiteracy is so high? And illiteracy, again and again, was pointed to by Bolshevik party members, policymakers, theorists, officials at Narkompros, as one of the chief obstacles to remaking a new way of life. By 1920, 85% of urban boys and girls aged 13 to 19 were literate. They could read. And that's pretty astonishing. 1920, 85% of urban teenagers could read. The situation is very different in the village, where illiteracy remains the glaring problem. By 1926, more than half of the rural population, 55%, were illiterate. So if reading is the path forward to a bright, radiant future, if books will allow us to make this jump, as the poster suggests, into the bright, radiant city of labor, art, and science, we need to teach the Soviet citizenry how to read. The importance of reading was stressed in propaganda from the Civil War and throughout NEP. This is a poster from the Civil War era that reminds viewers, take care of your book. It is your faithful comrade on the march and in peaceful labor as well. And you see here up at the top, you see a peasant woman helping her son or grandson to read. Here you see a young boy reading to his grandfather and to some interested party who's barged in. And here at the bottom, I love this scene. You have the Red Army guy, the smoke of war all about him, and he's just taking a minute off of from the machine gun to take a look at his book. But the idea is that soldiers and civilians need to learn the value of reading. That the book is your true and faithful comrade, Verni Tavarish, while you're in service or engaged in peaceful socialist labor. So don't use books, don't tear out the pages and roll cheap cigarettes. You can actually read them, they have value. On December 26th, 1919, the height of the Civil War, the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party, declares war on illiteracy. And the goal of this war, the party declares, is the liquidation of illiteracy amongst citizens aged 8 to 50. An interesting cutoff date. Those above 50 were deemed hopeless cases. You can't teach anyone over the age of 50 anything. It's not true, but that's the Bolshevik conceit here. Let's just get the core of the population on board with our literacy program. Well, those of you, again, who've studied literacy as a historical problem or as a classroom pedagogical problem in the present day know that what do we mean by literacy? The Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party, defines literacy in very simple terms. The idea is that all adults, male and female, are required to learn to read either Russian or their native tongue. If they can show proficiency in reading Ukrainian, Yiddish, Georgian, Belarusian, whatever. But you have to be able to read either Russian or your native tongue, the language you speak at home with your family. If you're unable to learn on your own, you will be taught how to read. Narkompros will recruit brigades, and they use this word, brigadi. They use the military word, brigade, to describe these retinues of literate citizens who will go into the village and teach peasant men, women, and children how to read. The idea behind the literacy drive, as Lunacharsky explained, was to enable the entire population to take a conscious, active part in the country's political life. Lenin had famously said that when we build the Soviet Republic, even the most common kitchen cook, and he used the word for a woman cook, even the most common woman line cook will be able to lead the state. Well, that can't work until you can get people to read. So the purpose here is, again, to get everyone on board for taking a conscious part in the country's political life. That's the carrot. There's always a stick to Bolshevik policy. As we saw, citizens who refuse to learn to read would be liable to criminal prosecution. So all across Soviet Russia, from the end of 1919 forward, you have these likpunkti set up in villages and rural towns, some in the cities, but again, illiteracy was not much of a problem in the urban centers. So the likpunkti were largely rural phenomena. They're set up in villages and towns all across Soviet Russia. Likpunkti, literally liquidation points for the liquidation of illiteracy, kind of mini Kaplan centers, if you will, that offered crash courses for illiterate rural audiences, lasting about 3 months, kind of intensive cram programs that required about 144 hours of classroom attendance. Between 1920 and 1926, 5 million people, mostly rural women, went through these new literacy classes. So a good example of a successful Bolshevik policy in these early periods. Um, Propaganda from the 1920s emphasizes the positive advantages that literacy will bring to the Soviet people, especially the peasantry. And this is a little poster that we'll take a look at here in a moment, um, emphasizing, addressing a peasant audience and emphasizing the material advantages of literacy. If the love of learning alone is not enough to inspire you to read, there's some material gain here to be had. The idea is that literacy will lift you up out of cultural backwardness, and it will improve the material everyday prosperity of your lives as well. So this is a terrific poster from the early 1920s, and we see two parallel strips: the life of an illiterate and the life of a literate man. And you see at every step, at every stage, the life of the illiterate beats the hell out of the life of the illiterate. The life of the literate is always better than the life of the illiterate. The illiterate guy is standing here scratching his head, wondering why his wheat doesn't grow. The literate man, who's read a few books, who knows a few things, knows when you're supposed to sow, how much you're supposed to water, how you're supposed to treat the soil beforehand. And look at their modes of dress, right? This guy's wearing lapti, literally woven bark, birch bark. The smart guy, the literate guy, has got nice boots. He's not a kulak, though, don't worry. He's just got nice boots. Well, here you see again, the peasant, the illiterate peasant, doesn't know why old Bessie's died. The wife's ashamed. The kid's in tears. But the literate peasant, right, has just gone into the city, and thanks to the new economic reforms of NEP, sold his big fattened cow at a nice profit. Well, when old illiterate Ivan goes into the city, he doesn't know where to go. And you see him standing like a rube in the middle of the city street, wondering where to go. Well, when the literate man comes to the city with his goods to sell and on a mission to buy cool stuff too to take back home, look at him striding proudly. He can read city signs. He can read a map. He knows how to navigate this unfamiliar urban space and make it his own, right? So again, a great contrast. And finally, at the end of days, the illiterate man dies premature. Note how young his son is, with a pretty sparsely furnished, unremarkable home. The literate peasant will live much longer with his wife beside him. I don't know what happened to her in this panel, but anyway, his wife is still beside him. His son is much older. He's got a shelf full of books. He's got a nice flower. He's got wooden boards instead of dirt floors, and a real room instead of just a traditional kind of peasant hut. So literacy is sold by the regime to peasant audiences, not just as an opportunity for cultural uplift, but also as an opportunity for prosperity, an opportunity to improve the quality and caliber of one's life. And it's too small to make out here, but there's some funny little rhyming couplets mocking the illiterate, praising the efforts of the literate. That connection between knowledge, production, and prosperity is very closely linked here. In order to have more, it is necessary to produce more. In order to produce more, it is necessary to know more. So knowledge is the key. And again, you see how the emphasis on learning, the emphasis on education extends beyond the classroom in the 1920s. And a new sort of smyczka is introduced here too. Remember we talked about with NEP, the togetherness, the union of worker and peasant, the hammer and sickle, the union of city and country. Here we see the union of labor, productivity, and the book, right? The peasant and knowledge. Literacy among peasant women was very low. for a number of historical reasons going back well before the 19th century. Peasant women were not expected to learn to read. Peasant women had to juggle all manner of other responsibilities. And so during the literacy campaigns of the 1920s, peasant women were targeted by Narkompros. We want to get peasant women to learn to read. This would be a huge culture change in the village. So here you see a great poster from the 1920s, basically guilting its audience of peasant women into learning how to read. And you see this little girl sitting at the table, the samovar, uh, bubbling tea in the back, and she's stuck doing her homework. And she says, "Oh, Mamachka, if only you were literate, you could help me. But you're not." So the top says, addressing peasant women, "Woman, learn to read, right? Become literate. Study and become literate." Um, once the peasant woman is literate, a whole new world opens up, and we'll talk more about gender roles in our second lecture. But this is an interesting little uh, poster from the 1920s, reminding peasant women that just because you've gone through the classrooms, through the Likpunkti, and done your 144 hours or whatever, you got to keep reading. Reading is a skill that requires maintenance. So if you learn to read, um, and this one says, if you don't read books, you'll soon forget your literacy. You'll soon lose the ability. And here you see a woman in a traditional kind of peasant kerchief keeping up with her skills by reading a copy of 10 Days That Shook the World, the account of the October Revolution by the American journalist John Reed. You could still read John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World in Soviet Russia in the 1920s. It became harder to read in the 1930s because the book had nothing to say about Stalin, and so the book fell out of print, not accidentally, during the Stalin years. Here, another message addressed to literate women, visually reminiscent of that famous Civil War poster that we saw, the personal appeal, and it asks, have you signed up to be a volunteer? Here it says, are you helping to liquidate illiteracy? And that verb, likvidirovat, to liquidate, is a very telling word. The Cheka uses it. We're going to liquidate the bourgeoisie. We'll see it under Stalin. We're going to liquidate the kulaks. Here we're going to liquidate illiteracy. And this militaristic language, I think, is very telling. There is a war against illiteracy. And it's just that, a war. And just as the Civil War required recruits, so too does the war against illiteracy require the recruitment of literate women to do the bidding of the party. So it calls upon women to join the society called Down with Illiteracy, Daloi Negramotnost, and join the society. This poster here on the right is from 1925-26, and you see a little image of the now dead Lenin, who dies in 24, and a quote from Lenin that says, by the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution, there must not be a single illiterate person in the Soviet Union. Right, so we must achieve Lenin's goal. And after Lenin's death, this becomes a common way of inspiring audiences, of building up interest and drive for the party's directives, fulfilling the testament, fulfilling the wishes of our beloved Lenin. Now, to pass these literacy courses that we're talking about, held in the Likpunkti, to be deemed literate was not that hard. Your final exam was to sort of demonstrate to the instructor that you could read large print, basically aloud. You could sound it out, essentially, syllable by syllable. You did not need to demonstrate an ability to write, which caused officials at Narkomprost to pull out their hair. Well, what is literacy? Literacy isn't just reading. Literacy is also the ability to convey and transfer information. One of Lunacharsky's deputies said, well, we ought to call these semi-literacy programs because we're not really teaching them anything. But if we back up and look at the big picture, these were huge changes in rural culture especially. And the Soviet literacy campaigns of the 1920s, I think, probably go down still to this day as some of the most sustained and comprehensive attempts ever made by a modern state to combat illiteracy. And in the decades to come, Soviet officials will brag with justification that they have, in a matter of generations, gone from a barefoot, backwards, illiterate population to a population that ranks at the top of global measurements, global metrics in terms of literacy, scientific knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to turn briefly here to, and if you want to pause and come back, that's fine. We're talking a lot, but I get kind of excited about this topic of culture building. I think is really rather fascinating. Illiteracy was a problem to be overcome, right? When you read the piece by Aaron Soltz on communist ethics, he talks about the deformities of capitalism that we have to overcome now that we're building the socialist society. He talks about the capitalist hump, in the sense of this kind of burden that has been left upon us, that's weighing us down, that's distorting our step. We need to shed off this capitalist hump, this deformity, if you will, in a very non-politically correct metaphor that Soltz is using, if we're going to remake patterns of everyday life, if we're going to remake Buit. And this extended even into questions of health and hygiene. The People's Commissariat of Enlightenment, Narkompros, was involved, as was the People's Commissariat of Health, in this massive campaign in the 1920s to change the way that Soviet citizens thought about hygiene, cleanliness, the spread of disease. So this is a poster from Soviet Ukraine from the very early 1920s, probably during the Civil War still. And you see this horror scene of enormous, larger than life flies, lice, fleas, sowing disease, wreaking havoc, bringing death literally in their wake. And the poster calls upon everyone to rise up and join the fight against pestilence. So again, calling upon that voluntarist ethos of the Civil War and the militarization of rhetoric here, right? The battle against disease is a battle, just as the battle against the white armies is a battle. The 20s are a period of remarkable militarization of Soviet rhetoric. Everything is a front. We're fighting on the anti-religious front against believers and religious traditions and superstitions. We're fighting on the health front against the spread of disease. We're fighting on the battlefront against the whites. That connection is made very clear in this poster, again, from the very end of the Civil War. And it says that the Red Army has beaten the White Guard parasites, Generals Yudenich, Denikin, Admiral Kolchak, but a new misfortune has fallen upon us, the typhus lice, the louse, plural lice, that carry the disease of typhus. So very interesting. We've killed off one parasite, or one set of parasites, the white generals, but now here's a literal biological parasite that's threatening to do us great harm. So comrades, go to battle against this infectious disease, eliminate the typhus louse. And you see Red Army men and a medical personage here in the background taking proper hygienic measures against the spread of typhus through this tiny little louse that got into soldiers' clothing and knapsacks and was passed all around. So hot baths, hot scalding water, proper hot laundry and soap, beating the laundry in preparation to kill any lice or disrupt their eggs, and here, washing the hell out of it in boiling water, hanging it to dry. So bleaching linens, anything you can do to destroy the threat. So again, the emphasis here is on timeliness. The enemy is defeated. The white parasites are gone, but an even bigger, although smaller, white parasite awaits us. It'll kill us all if we're not careful. So we need to militarize our labor, as Trotsky says in the readings from a week or so ago. Militarize our labor, organize along the new front of public health and hygiene. This is a remarkable poster, wordy, a lot of text, but it's a 1920s poster from Odessa, the port city in the south of Ukraine, warning about how syphilis is spread. And this is probably something that would have been hanging in a doctor's office or, excuse me, or in an office of public health, a clinic, warning people about the ways in which syphilis can be easily spread by non-sexual means, right? So people knew syphilis could be spread through sexual contact, but there were all sorts of intimate daily exchanges that could foster the spread of syphilis. For instance, picking up a cigarette on the sidewalk that someone has just thrown out, putting it in your mouth. Well, if smoker one was syphilitic, this little opportunistic guy just got syphilis too. Kissing guests on the mouth, that can be a problem. The rural custom of sharing a single wooden spoon and dipping a wooden spoon into a communal bowl, drinking from communal glasses. And although it's not on here, another target in the war against syphilis and infectious disease in general was church custom. In the Orthodox, in the Russian Orthodox tradition, when you take communion, the holy sacrament of the Eucharist, the bread is taken by the clergy, put on a long decorative spoon, dipped into the wine, and the consecrant who's taking communion accepts into his mouth on this communal spoon the bread and wine, the body and blood of Christ. Well, another strike in the minds of the Bolsheviks against religious tradition, right? Not only is religious tradition disruptive, dangerous, an obstacle to the construction of socialism, but it's also a means for the spread of disease. Kissing icons in churches as a show of reverence, kissing the holy relics of saints to whom you pray in search of a miraculous cure. These kinds of religious practices now become recoded by the Bolsheviks, not as acts of piety and veneration, but as acts of ignorance that help to foster the spread of disease and need to be eliminated. Religion is a big problem. I don't want to dwell on this. This is the last short little topic I want to touch on here in our discussion of culture. This is an image. I've seen it dated 1917, in which case it's awfully early, but it does harken back to certain pre-revolutionary symbols and tropes. The caption at the bottom reads "Spider and Flies," and it shows an Orthodox clergyman rendered, monstrously as a kind of spider in his web. The church is at the heart of the spider web, and as the believers come through the church gates or enter the monastery grounds, they're being scooped up by the spider priest, who will literally feed off of them. And this is a common refrain in Soviet anti-religious propaganda, that the priest does nothing. The monk contributes nothing to society, right? They are parasites. They feed off the labor of the working class, whom they have tricked into supporting them, right? The priests trick the peasants and workers. The monks and nuns trick the peasants and workers into bringing them money, bringing them food, bringing them offerings that support their parasitical lifestyle. And so, again, just as in the war on hygiene, there's this kind of notion of infection, of predation, of danger. So too in a lot of this anti-religious propaganda. So let me. I just want to show a few just really quick examples. We could spend an entire semester on the party's attitude toward religion and belief, how it changes somewhat over time. And one of my favorite topics. I've written about this and done research. If you have questions, let me know. But here's a poster. This is actually a little bit later, from the early 30s. Down with church festivals. Down with church holidays. Well, why? Church holidays were associated in popular culture, peasant culture, with drunken revelry. And it could take, in the village, a good week for the peasants to sober up, the peasant men, to sober up from a good old-fashioned church holiday, the Feast of Saint So-and-so, and get back into the fields. Well, with the emphasis on production, as we'll see with the 5-year plan in Stalin in the weeks to come, you can't have your workers hungover, drunk, unable to produce. Do away with church holidays. They are destructive, they are outmoded, they're archaic, and we need to stop all of the nonsense associated with them. And you can just barely make out some of the, under the towers of the church, what misfortunes attend the church holidays. People getting run over by streetcars in city thoroughfares, drunken physical altercations between husbands and wives. This is the consequence of bad behavior, but it's a bad behavior that is fostered by this toxic influence of the church that has permeated so many aspects of everyday life and needs to be eliminated. A point made very clearly in this image: religion is poison, protect your children. And we see this generational conflict here, right? The conflict over religion is shown in this great poster to be a generational one. The little girl in her pioneer best is reaching for the shkola, the school, right? Little Komsomol boys blowing the horn. An airplane flies over, like this great symbol of modernity, of progress, of technology. The Soviets were obsessed with airplanes and air travel. Not so much commercial air travel, but exploratory air travel, flying planes over the polar ice caps, mapping crazy islands in the Arctic Ocean. Great aviatory achievements. And meanwhile, the old hideous grandmother is trying to pull by the ponytail, no less, her darling rosy-cheeked granddaughter backwards in time to this decrepit, ramshackle church. No airplanes here, just a bunch of bats in the belfry and some creepy priest who's luring the kid in. So protect your children from the poison that is religion. Striking, I think. I want to close here with one last. I hope this will work. Let me put this up and see. And if it doesn't work, my apologies. And if it doesn't work, it's not that important. But this is an example of anti-religious poetry from the 1920s. And it's written by an obscure fellow named Ananyev, published in 1924, published in a journal, or a newspaper rather, called Nash Bezbozhnik, Our Godless, or Our Atheist, in the summer of 1924, page 1, right on the front page. Our Holy Trinity, our Holy Trinity. Now, if those of you schooled in Christian theology, the Holy Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we, building a new socialist world, put forward, posit a new Trinity. An entire life is being built without master, without servant. The book, the hammer, the plow, this is our Trinity. We do not pray to it, nor light candles before it, but from its heated flames furnaces are stoked. We don't burn incense to the Virgin Mary in icon corners, but all the same, wheat still grows in the fields. Gross industrial output rises. Only in Soviet poetry would you find gross industrial output rising. Our forces are ripe in strength, and the gods clamber about in the cellar, now made obsolete. The idea is that Soviet power has sort of thrown out the old gods, locked them in the cellar. They can bang around until they're too tired to do so any longer, and we can be rid of them once and for all. From land to land, again, the emphasis on internationalism, the whole world is being rebuilt, and our Trinity will construct this paradise, the paradise of socialism, and from there the communist utopia to come. It will be built not with the aid of God the Father, Christ the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as was believed in times past, but rather by the book, knowledge, by the hammer, industrial labor, and by the plow, agricultural labor. So the smuchka of worker and peasant, armed, incandesced with the fire of learning, the book, this will be the Trinity, the tripartite force that builds the new world. And to build that new world means getting rid of all elements of cultural backwardness, shedding what Solz calls the deformity, right? That hump, that capitalist hump. Get rid of it. Shed it off. Overcome the backwardness of peasant agriculture. Overcome the crippling deformities of illiteracy that hold back production. Overcome the ill effects of poor hygiene, which foster the spread of disease, right? Overcome the limitations that religion places on the possibilities that lie before us, right? All of these пережитки, all of these backwards vestiges need to be overcome because they're inhibiting the development of socialism. So there's an important element here of, again, the relationship between theory and practice. Yes, all of these пережитки, all of these vestiges are to be rejected because they're backwards, right? But they're to be rejected because they're backwards and holding us back from realizing socialism. So again, the relationship between theory and practice is very clear here. And what I've tried to show you too is how the Bolsheviks, not just the officials at Narkompros, but all Bolshevik theorists, all Bolshevik policymakers in the 20s are wrestling with this. They're trying to use all media at their disposal. Poems, posters, newspaper articles, the Lichtpunkte, to use all the powers of state institutions as well to overcome this and create a new culture. And it's not just about creating a new culture. It's because you need to create a new culture that will hold in place the new socioeconomic base that we're building, that of socialism. So I want to stop here. I know this was very long. I hope it was somewhat interesting. I enjoyed it. But I want to hold off here. And our next lecture later, watch it whenever you want, but I'll post 2 lectures this week. The second one is going to be about family policy, gender policy, and it's going to be a continuation of the themes that we're exploring here today. So I'm going to get us out of here, stop the share, and again, questions, let me know. But hopefully this will provide some context for the readings that you're doing this week, I'm doing this week, and that we're going to talk about on Friday, okay? So I will see you in our second lecture in just a bit. Thanks.